And in the U.S., we're following Donald Trump's victory. An elector from a state, the president-elect one, says he's faced pressure and even death threats to change his decision in the Electoral College vote later this month. A youth vice chairman of the Michigan Republican Party, Michael Bennerin, described to us the messages he received.
Unfortunately, this election cycle was pretty divisive on both sides of the aisle, and that's bled over into the weeks following it. And as a presidential elector from Michigan, unfortunately, I've just been inundated with hundreds and hundreds of emails, Facebook messages, letters to my home, about 4 or 5 a day, tweets. And in those messages, unfortunately, some of them have been death threats, death wishes, and just generally angry messages from people who can't accept the results of the election.
US Electoral College voters are also facing other kinds of pressure ahead of the official election on December the 19th. More than 4.7 million people have signed a petition calling on electors to ignore their state's votes and cast their ballot for Hillary Clinton. Among electors themselves, some have been trying to convince others to vote for a compromised Republican candidate in a bid to stop Trump. And after calls from Clinton's camp and Jill Stein from the Green Party, a recount has been initiated in several states. Here's Michael Bennerin again, and he says those who are calling for a change to the election system aren't considering all possible consequences.
It's one of those situations where when you're on the losing side, you look for every possibility to change the outcome so that you can come out on top. And right now we have people on the left that are upset with Donald Trump winning. And so they're calling for a new system, a national popular vote, without really considering the consequences. That would leave so many Americans' voices out of the process, and it would allow our elections to really just be dominated by a few large population, densely populated states. So I guess I would say I'm not shocked, but more disappointed that Americans couldn't live up to the standard that we've always lived up to and just accept the results of these elections and move on as a united country.
Meanwhile, those struggling to accept the election result have found a number of ways to cope with Donald Trump's victory.
This after New Balance spokesman Matt LeBreton told the Wall Street Journal that things, quote, will move in the right direction with President-elect Donald Trump.
Colleges across the country are canceling tests, offering therapy dogs, and free passes to skip class to those students who are just so upset.
Specifically, the people who are very upset right now are primarily coming from the Democratic Party. And over the last, 8 years, the Democratic Party has been in power, and they've become more and more insulated. They've stopped listening to people with other opinions. They've really shut themselves off and try to just railroad their policies through based on having a president in charge. Now the Democrats who previously were in charge are all of a sudden terrified. They don't know what's happened because they just have not been listening to the American people for 8 years. The American people have been having all kinds of political discussions, all kinds of political dissatisfaction, but the Democratic Party and many Democrats, unfortunately, have just been unaware of what's been going on. And now there's been this drastic and sudden wake-up call, and they just weren't ready for it.
Disappointment over Trump's victory and feelings that it's somehow illegitimate are being fanned by the mainstream media, which is continuing to push the idea that Russia meddled in the U.S. presidential election, alleging also that so-called fake news is a Russian tool to influence political affairs. RT's Ganich Jakan explains.
The U.S. mainstream media has seized on a Washington Post article alleging Russian interference in the U.S. election through what it called fake news. The article was based on claims by a mysterious group called Prop or Not, which labeled some 200 alternative news outlets as peddlers of Russian propaganda. When some journalists asked the project to explain why websites like a popular portal, Drudge Report, were on the list, Prop or Not had nothing better to reply than, quote, They refer audiences to sort of Russian stuff, end quote. Some journalists have shamed the Washington Post for the fake news story, calling it disgusting or propaganda about Russian propaganda. One outlet discreetly switched its headline from "Research confirms Russia's role in spreading fake news" to "Research suggests." With some caveats, mainstream media outlets continue with the narrative.
And there's no question that Russia has a very robust system of putting out fake news and other types of propaganda.
Most reports on the subject seem to suggest that Russia's fake news ploy has helped Trump win the election.
The losing side in the American election are desperate to make out that it was a Russian hack and that the American election was hacked by the Russians, which is clearly a little bit hysterical. The fact is the Democrats just didn't understand the mood of the American people.
Newsweek even looked beyond the US election and questioned the legitimacy of the Brexit vote based on the outlet's assertion that, quote-unquote, the Russian disinformation campaign may have influenced the outcome.
The underlying suggestion in many of these reports is that Russia managed to sway voters, that maybe without Russia, Hillary Clinton would have won or Brexit would not have happened. It creates an image of Russia as this all-powerful game changer, but that suggestion seems to disregard the ability of voters to think and decide for themselves. In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chekyan, RT.
Glenn Greenwald, a former Guardian reporter and co-founder of The Intercept online publication, has compared the current anti-Russia narrative to 1950s rhetoric.
Even more disturbing than the Post's shoddy journalism in this instance is the broader trend in which any wild conspiracy theory or McCarthyite attack is now permitted in the US discourse, as long as it involves Russia and Putin. Just as was true in the 1950s, when stories of how the Russians were poisoning the US water supply or infiltrating American institutions were commonplace.
The communist fifth columnists among us are working for world dictatorship. To accomplish this, their strategy is to undermine the confidence of our people in the American system.
Any anti-Russia story was and is instantly vested with credibility, while anyone questioning its veracity or evidentiary basis is subject to attacks on their loyalties.
The U.S. House of Representatives has moved to ban the financing of any bilateral military cooperation between the U.S. and Russia in a new defense budget bill. Caleb Maupin has more details from New York.
The bill forbids any cooperation between the United States and Russia on military affairs, and it specifically talks about Crimea. The bill allocates $3.4 billion for what it calls Russian deterrence, as well as political and economic diplomacy designed to counter the influence of Russia. And it specifically highlights Crimea and forbids any recognition of Crimea as part of the Russian Federation. There's one exception in the bill for military cooperation between the United States and Russia, and that's Afghanistan. Now, the bill mentions Russia many times. Russia comes across in a lot of the language. It brings up Russia. Now, Donald Trump, the president-elect of the United States, is yet to take office, and it's unclear exactly how this bill and its anti-Russian language is going to affect Trump as his administration prepares to take office.
However, it's not the first time the U.S. House of Representatives has proposed anti-Russia moves. This year alone has seen a number of examples. In March, American congressmen introduced a bill aimed at suppressing alleged propaganda and disinformation from being spread, with a focus on Russia and China. Throughout 2016, there's been a steady buildup of troops by the U.S. and Britain along Russia's borders. And just days ago, the House of Representatives passed an intelligence authorization bill containing a provision aimed at tackling what Washington claims as political interference by Russia on a global level. William Jones of the Executive Intelligence Review told us that these actions may become a thing of the past as Obama's time in office comes to an end.
Well, this is still a part of the present paradigm that we have with the Obama administration. And what you're seeing now is really the tail end of the donkey, so to speak, with less than 2 months left in his administration. But it seems to me that we are moving into a situation where everything that's being done now is largely on hold Now, money will be allocated if this bill goes through, and it's not clear that it will go through. There have been objections that have been raised by the Secretary of Defense, and there was also consideration by the White House because it has exceeded the limits that the White House put on the original bills.
Now, after the break, we'll look at the motion to impeach South Korea's president as fresh protests there draw thousands of demonstrators.